there's a little bit of an over obsession with meaning and why. The idea of if you keep asking why, you'll get to the core, you'll get to the truth. And often that leads to an over obsession with meaning. What's the problem with a lot of the purpose stuff is that we think that a brand needs to have this do good, be better for the world kind of purpose, and that will automatically attract people to your brand because you're good or better or brave. That sort of like thinking is wrong.
Packaging design should seduce, inform, and even save the planet. I'm Hernan Braverman, and this is BRANDERMAN, the podcast where I talk with experts to uncover what it actually takes to make a positive impact on consumers, the market, and society. Warning: keep this podcast out of the reach of close-minded marketers and designers. Before the interview, let me introduce my design agency.
Brands with purpose. Human, agile, honest brands that leave no one indifferent. Tridimage creates and revitalizes brands to imagine and shape the future. Tridimage, the branding and packaging design agency for bold brands.
Today I had the pleasure to talk with Stef Hamerlinck, a brand strategist and designer living in Belgium. He runs his own branding studio with a wide variety of international clients in the CPG space. His podcast Let's Talk Branding is a critical exploration of all things brand. It features weekly interviews with industry leaders such as Byron Sharp, Phil Barden, Martin Neumeyer, and many more experts, and has become a staple for brand builders. In this episode, Stef defines branding and explains why it matters. He even states that not all brands necessarily have to be different, and that brand purpose is overrated. He also shares some design lessons he has learned over the years in brand consultancy. Today with me, Stef Hamerlinck. Stef, each of us is a container of ideas, projects, and dreams. However, we can't read the label when we are inside the jar. What do you think your label says, or what would you like it to say?
Great question. I think it probably would depend on who you're asking, of course, but all around people would probably say something along the lines of the guy that knows quite a lot about strategy, but also does a lot of brand design. That would probably be, hopefully, the most they would know about me.
That sounds great. Building a brand is like a journey. It starts with defining where we are and asking ourselves where we want to go. How was the path that led you from studying design to turning into a brand strategist? Take us back to where it all began for you as a designer.
Okay, let's go way back. I say around probably, 15 years now, since I started my career, quote unquote, in design. I started a small agency together with my brother, and we basically did everything. I was like an all-around designer, visual person. I like doing animation. I like doing 3D. I like doing web design. I like doing brand design. I liked everything. And I did everything basically. And that went on for a couple of years, and we didn't have the best clients. It was a lot of frustrating work, a lot of like small stuff coming at us because we weren't really specialized in any way. So gradually I started being more interested in like the story behind the brief, or at least the reasons why I needed to do certain design. And I started to organize these story sessions. That was really like the turning point for me. As soon as I started talking to clients about, hey, why do you want to do this, and what's behind this, and like who is it for, and what has changed, and like all of these questions, I started seeing one, that clients started to trust me a lot more. They appreciated me a lot more. Also, when it came to designing, things were a lot easier, went a lot quicker. And so gradually I started learning about what I was actually doing, which was basically some form of brand strategy. And so I started reading more books and getting deeper into that stuff because I really felt something clicked for me. And that's when I started doing more than just workshops. I started researching the competition. I started asking consumers what they think about the brand. I started redefining the brand. I started defining the brand language and so on. And so gradually I came into this bigger field of really the brand strategy. But I always kept my other feet into the design because I hope to think I'm a creative person and I love the actual design part as well. So that has always been like a little bit of finding a balance for me, because for a lot of people, it's like once you become the strategist, you leave design behind. That's not my path. I can get a project doing just purely like strategy consultancy, or I can do a full like branding project as traditionally done by branding studios.
What wisdom have you gained in the process of hosting Let's Talk Branding podcast?
Oh, man, so much. I mean, I think that my best choice in my career was starting to talk to people that are a lot smarter than me. I was really surprised how easy it was to talk to people that are really like, let's say, high up the ladder, like Marty Neumeyer or Byron Sharp. And that was already a first lesson. Like, don't be afraid to reach out and talk to these people because you can have really interesting conversation. And then more on the, let's say, the knowledge side of what I have learned is that there is not really one framework, one perspective that is like the end all be all for brand building. And especially this happened when I started talking to Byron Sharp, who is a person that causes a lot of friction because his theory goes against a lot of what we learn about branding. For example, he says meaningful differentiation doesn't really matter.
No,
which is probably no. What are you saying? That's
no.
like that. Don't do this. Don't do it on the podcast, Stef. But yeah, I mean, it's not that he completely changed everything I thought about branding, but he gave me like this completely different perspective from a scientific angle, which was really good for me to learn to be more critical, to be more nuanced, to look at context, to look at science, rather than just accepting what all the branding gurus say, which is differentiate or die and like the whole lingo around that, where there's still value in that. I think that was probably a huge change and a shift for me. Now I've been like a little bit of this annoying person trying to ask questions and be critical about certain definition and things that go around in the branding industry. And personally, for me, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think as a strategist or even as a creative person, you need to be able to question the box you're in. Otherwise, you're just going to end up doing a lot of like repetitive and maybe boring work.
Stef, I have a very easy question for you. Why do we need brands?
That's a great question. It's very easy, actually. Why do we need brands? We need brands so we can recognize the products or service we want to buy. For example, let's say you go in a store and you buy a milk, but there's like no difference between the different milk suppliers. How can you go back the next time and make sure you had the same milk? That's like the basic core function of why we need brands. It's basically to make sure we know who is it from. And then, of course, there's the whole wish-wash about perception and changing beliefs and all that. But that's really like nice to have. I think what I just told you is probably the core of why we need brands in the first place.
I love your definition of branding, which says that branding is the deliberate, continuous process of developing observable, distinctive assets associated with a product or service. Can you break it down for our listeners?
Sure. So I think a couple of important aspects there. Branding is deliberate. So that's already a very important point. Deliberate, meaning it's not just per accident, because of course you can have a brand per accident. For example, you can go out every day with a red hat and not think about it, and that can become part of your brand. But that's not branding. Branding is really a discipline. It's a management process. That's why I put that word deliberate there. And continuous process. So it's a deliberate, continuous process. Continuous is a very important word because it's not just a one-off. A lot of people in the industry talk about rebrands. They love seeing rebrands, and that looks like to be the core of branding. Actually, if you look at big brands, they continuously manage their branding, their assets, they evolve them, they make sure some of them grow, other ones die out. So deliberate, continuous process of developing observable, distinctive assets. Observable is, of course, important in the sense that maybe you have a bunch of assets that aren't observable. Maybe you can't smell them, hear them, see them. Then they're not really part of the branding. Sometimes maybe that might be something that's part of your culture or something else, but it's hard for a consumer to pick up on that. Distinctive, the key word here, of course, for me, probably like the holy grail is distinctiveness, is basically being able to be recognized from competitors. So basically somebody sees you and sees a competitor and they immediately know, okay, you're the other one, and they know who you are. Being distinctive, very important. Not to be confused with being differentiated, which is more about being perceived as being meaningfully different. Distinctive is more about just looking different, basically. And then, of course, assets is a very important word because a logo, a typeface, an illustration, a pattern, a color combination, whatever it is, these are valuable assets to a company, at least built up over time, of course. And so these assets have a monetary value. They have equity inside of them. And so that's something we need to realize. Again, when we're rebranding, we're throwing away money, not just design assets. And then the last part is associated with a product or service, which I think makes sense.
Yeah. Do you think that positioning is useless and that brand purpose is overrated?
We're getting into it, man. We're getting into it. Yeah, I think positioning is definitely overrated in terms of what people expect it will do for the brand, and especially for the bottom line, for the sales. Positioning is a really powerful tool if you're thinking about internal alignment, if you're thinking about giving an organization a good understanding of how they are perceived, and then them doubling down on that and communicating on that. I think that's very powerful. If an organization understands their position well, they can keep building on that and they can strong in those associations. Sometimes they can even slightly shift those associations, but that is a very hard game. And that's exactly where positioning is overrated, where people think if I position my brand as X, people will come to me because I'm positioned like X. But the reality is that most positioning is very often just retrofitting a certain perception or reputation that's already out there. Of course, with new products, you need to position somehow in the market, but that won't mean that you will actually be perceived as such. Second part of your question, purpose. It depends on how you define purpose. What's the problem with a lot of the purpose stuff is that we think that a brand needs to have this do good, be better for the world kind of purpose, and that will automatically attract people to your brand because you're good or better or brave. That sort of like thinking is wrong. There are some strategists out there that just see purpose as like, why do you exist? What problem do you solve? I think that's purposes can be a good tool for alignment. But the problem comes really when we see all of these brands having the same type of language and trying to convince you so hard of why they are good for the world. It's just not the thing that will automatically attract customers. And therefore, it should not be like a thing you do, like a marketing trick in some way.
Stef, branding seems to be a complex process. Is there a compass to navigate the turbulent waters of brand building? Is it enough to find the essence of a brand and write a nice story?
That's interesting. JP Castlin talks a lot about complexity. And as you said, it's almost impossible to have like a one solution, one framework for brand building that will work for everything, because complexity, because randomness, because things happen that you will never have control over. You might have the best possible rebrand or packaging refresh in your mind, and then a competitor might roll out with something very similar. You don't have control over that part. It's finding a balance between what JP calls like emergence, which is basically being open for things that are happening, but creating certain boundaries within that. For example, knowing what you absolutely cannot do as a brand, or knowing who you absolutely cannot target as a brand, or knowing what you as a business are really weak at and really strong at. Those can be like boundaries where you set your brand within, but within that you can create a lot of freedom and you can shift or pivot, as some people like to call it. Another crucial part is understanding that when you are brand building, you are basically generating future demand. What that means is that you are creating like communications and assets and touch points towards people that do not know your brand yet. And so basically building brand means trying to reach people that maybe will buy in the future. And I think that is like a commonality that is often underestimated when we're talking about brand building. We see a lot of people talking about short-term tactics and marketing and getting sales. But one thing I do see in commonality between all projects is that level of brand building going beyond what you have in the market right now is something very interesting and powerful to work on.
Most companies think brand building is not for them, or that it's too expensive, especially the research phase. But building a strong brand strategy doesn't require such large budgets anymore. What are some of the tools you use in a brand strategy process?
Google, definitely. Google is my friend for two main reasons. It's an easy window into the world. You can basically act like a consumer and type in some of the things you would type in when you're looking for this type of product or service. And you can see what pops up. It's not just competitors. Competitors are great and you can list them and you can look at their websites. You can look at their Instagram. You can look at anything. You can go do store visits. But it's also looking at blog articles and trend reports and all that stuff. There's a couple of specific tools that are interesting. Google Trends. Basically, you can look at how people are searching certain words or search terms, and you can see how that evolves over time. So it's very interesting to see how, for example, let's say you're selling cocktails. You want to do a new kind of like mojito. You can look at how the search intent for mojito has changed over the last 5 years, and you can map it against other search terms. And you can really start seeing where there's already like behavioral presets where people are already showing the actual behavior, which is a really good indicator that they will buy. It's probably the only real good indicator we have. All the rest is just assumptions. And there's a tool called My Telescope. There you can see what your share of the overall search in comparison to other brands. It's very interesting because the science tells us that this is a very good proxy for market share, which is of course like a very good metric to track, because basically that is the almighty metric when it comes to loyalty and growing your brand. One more is probably things like Pollfish, SurveyMonkey. These are really good tools for quantitative consumer research. If you want to know what people think about certain aspects or sentiments about the category, or you want to get to know how much awareness you have, you can find out those things through these tools, which basically have built-in audiences and can get you 4,000 answers within a couple of hours, targeted at a specific region. So yeah, just top of my mind, a couple of tools.
Great tools, yeah. What are the benefits of co-creation processes in workshops with clients?
It's very important in this type of work to give your client a sense of ownership, because, I mean, it is literally their brand, it's their company. And workshops are just a great way to kick off the project because you're asking them so many questions and you're really trying to understand them. And even just that on a human level creates a sort of bond between you and your client. It even goes farther for me. I really like continuous conversation with my client during a brand strategy project. We often have like a WhatsApp group where I daily send them like little things, screenshots. Maybe I'm walking in the street, I see an interesting thing happening or whatever. And we keep each other in the loop of our thinking. And there's like a lot of back and forth. And this is a really good thing to have because they really feel that you're part of the process as much as they are. This is really where things help in that ownership process.
Perfect. And then do you even share work in progress during the creative phase?
It's a difficult question because on the one hand, during the strategy process, I might get creative and I might show them design ID. And this is really where things are getting really interesting for me is I'm starting to get a little bit more experimental with brand strategy because I'm really comfortable, I think, at this point with what I know about it. And so sometimes what I do is, let's say we're talking about brand personalities and we're doing like this review of competitors and we see that we want to be a little bit different in personality. I can just quickly have a slide where there's like their brand, but reimagined with that personality, maybe changed colors, typefaces, added a different picture, whatever. And at that point, I'm mainly looking for confrontation, maybe even a little bit of shock moment where they're like, okay, that could be us. And this is where I like to infuse design. What I don't do is show them half screenshots of logos I'm working on or whatever. I don't do that. I go in my bunker and I work a week or two on my brand identity. I really fine tune it. I make sure it's like a bomb of a presentation. And I really make sure they're high-fiving at the end of it. And it's one direction. I'm not against sharing work during the process, but when it comes to that first brand identity and even packaging design draft, I do often go the extra mile of making it very polished to show them the first time, because I have a feeling that a lot of times when I do show them intermediate process work, they don't really grasp maybe the real context. And so for me, it's more important to see it as like a finished product than it will ever be at that point.
What are other design lessons you have learned over the years in brand consultancy?
Interesting. Not to be too detail oriented. And the reason I'm saying this is because I know a lot of designers that are probably 1,000 times better than me. I mean, they win all the awards. But what I do feel is that they sometimes overinvest in details, in design stuff that doesn't translate to consumers. My idea is really like looking away from the screen and looking back at the screen and just like, did I capture it at a glance? Like, what did I see? Did I see like something? For example, I did a brand where we had like this swirl across the packaging. Like that was the one thing that needed to stand out for me on all the touch points. And that's where I don't get too caught up on like design details of the width of the swirl. Does it match everywhere? And does it match with the width of the X height of the whatever? I mean, there's these designers, they can talk for hours about margins and paddings and stuff like that. But for me personally, in packaging design and branding design, that's not the essence. And that's one of the things I've learned, like focus on distinctiveness rather than fine detail.
Yeah. What for you defines a successful package design?
Distinctiveness. So, I'm getting repetitive, which is good, but successful packaging design is really about probably readability on the one hand. So making sure you understand what it is, because often we forget that part. And I've seen real issues with brands or even in stores where I saw something and I can immediately see the designer think, oh, this is so different. It's so cool. Where I think like, okay, but you've gone beyond any type of category code. And I'm not sure if people will pick up on it. And this is really where it's more of a question. I don't know if you've seen the liquid death water.
Yeah.
there's a lot of praise and hype about it. And I get why, because they're flipping a lot of the category codes. Basically, for listeners that don't know, it's like a death metal kind of vibe for water. And I'm not sure in terms of them being in retail, it would work. I'm not sure about that. That's the thing where there's a difference between what we in the branding world love and what works in consumer. And that's also partly the reason why if you go to any type of store out there now, you go to Walmart or whatever, and as a brand designer, you'll pick up 99% of the packages and say, that's ugly. But the problem is, yeah, I mean, maybe it's ugly from a design standpoint in some way, but it's working really well because people can pick up on it from 100 meters away. They see the color block, they see the typeface. They even know from like 10 meters away what variation they're looking at without having to think about it. They're probably listening to a podcast along the way. So this type of design, I'm really getting more and more appreciative of. Like I'm walking down the aisle and I'm starting to see, why are these washing products so colorful and bright and ugly? If I could do it, I would make it beautiful and like one color. You see these redesigns by students and a lot of designers. Like I rebranded this brand because they needed it. Well, actually, if they would do that, they would lose millions of dollars if they would follow the designer in that question. So that's where there's like this interesting friction. And this happens with me as well. I can drool over the Dialine Design Awards and everything, but it's just something we tend to forget. And why is not all design so beautiful if it would be performant?
Yeah. What are some of the biggest brand strategy and brand design challenges you have faced, and how did you overcome them?
I think maybe the biggest struggle I do find is probably because of my critical approach to all thinking in branding, whether that's Byron Sharp's or Marty Neumeier. It also gives you not a very solid floor to walk on, because basically you're questioning everything. And at a certain point, like, let's say if you're building rockets, you need to accept that, for example, gravity is a thing or whatever, because otherwise there's certain boundaries you need to accept. And I'm still looking where those boundaries are, because I do want like a little bit of walls around me and not stand in an open field and go any direction. So that's like probably been the biggest struggle for me in the last 2 to 3 years. But I feel like I've overcome a lot of it. And at this point, I'm confident enough to know in what context what will work, I guess. But I'm probably going to be saying another thing in 6 months.
What is the worst brand strategy crime you have ever seen or committed?
Oh, I see a lot of decks that are beautifully written, but basically don't have any real value in the organization. They sound smart, they look smart. I'm jealous of the copywriting. I'm jealous of the even of the design of it. But at the end of the day, if you look at how it implicates the business, the brand, there's just nothing happening. And you might say, well, that's not per se the strategist's fault. But often these decks are written in a way that you can't blame them anything, but you also can't take away anything from them. This language where it's like, we're all about this innovative, authentic feeling. And there's like, everybody's nodding when they see this presentation going, yeah, that's us for sure. But there's no real implications, and anyone in the organization doesn't understand anything what's going on with it. Trying to sound too smart, that's definitely something I did a lot, trying to compensate for those things. Also, what I did a lot is probably trying to force my own point of view. Like I already had an idea of where this brand should be headed. And I basically looked for facts and data that could conform my point of view. And I just stuffed that in a presentation and said like, hey, see, I'm right. This is what you need to do. And often that can lead to a decent enough strategy, but very often I just led it to a point of view, which was based on my personal preference. And that's probably my biggest crime I did. Yeah.
What do you think designers need to learn today that will help us in the next 10, 20, or even 30 years?
The easy thing would be to say, learn strategy and go buy my courses and we'll all get rich together. But the reality is, I think there's been a very big hype on brand strategy. The biggest thing is still when I look at good design and distinctiveness and branding and creative campaigns and whatever, is the craft of creativity. When I look now at my favorite rebrands and branding agencies out there, probably the things they're doing remind me more of design from 20, 40, 50, 60 years away than it reminds me of the design of 10 years away. So if anything, I'd say go back, learn your craft, and just focus on those things. I think there's plenty of room for people that just want to be creative. We should not force everyone into this idea of, hey, you should learn strategy, you should get a seat at a table. I mean, there's people that want that and that's good, but there's other people that can just be what they want to be, like free, creative, and just do crazy stuff and whatever. And if you feel you're always the one asking the bigger questions, or you want to solve bigger problems, then by all means, go ahead, look into marketing science, look into brand strategy, look into business strategy, whatever. And you can do it while still being a designer. I'm a testament of that. But if you want to be a creative designer and keep on being just creative and you're not interested in that part, I mean, work with a strategist or ask a good brief, or make sure there's at least some kind of phase before you where somebody has done some of the due diligence, and then you can go ahead and be crazy and be creative. So maybe go to art school or go to business school or whatever, but don't think you need to focus too much on the new shiny digital whatever stuff. I think that's not as important.
Great. Tell me something about design or strategy that's true that almost nobody agrees with you on.
Why is not that important? I mean, we've all been a little bit tricked by Simon Sinek, but he sold a lot of books by it. There's a little bit of an over-obsession with meaning and why. The idea of if you keep asking why, you'll get to the core, you'll get to the truth. And often that leads to an over-obsession with meaning. I was on a panel just last week with some very interesting people like Matt Davis and Peter Wilkins, people who've worked at Ogilvy and all the big agencies. And I think they probably all agreed on that branding is about creating meaning. And I was probably the only one that would disagree on that.
Stef, what is your next adventure?
I think, like on a career path, I just want to keep building my own studio. I've been doing interesting big global brands and then small startups and anything in between. So it's been an interesting ride. I want to finish this year and make like a good evaluation of where that's headed. And then on the other hand, I really want to keep doing this. My big next adventure would be going out there in the world, talking about branding and doing more courses and more collaborations, because maybe it's my brand purpose. I do think there's a need for more nuanced and critical debates on what branding is. I think I could be part of that movement. Yeah, that's probably my next adventure, or the one I'm working on.
Thanks so much. I think that you are definitively on a deliberate, continuous process of developing observable, distinctive skills to understand our profession. Congratulations, amigo.
Drop the mic. Thank you so much. This was really great. Love talking to you.
I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. You can check the episode notes for all the relevant links. I also invite you to follow me on Instagram and on my website, branderman.design. Follow the podcast in your favorite app so you don't miss the next episode of Branderman, the podcast where we try to uncover how to make a positive impact on consumers, the market, and society through package design.